Okay, so principle number one, if we want to deal with back pain successfully for the long term, is we have to get away with the notion of non-specific back pain. So that basically means is that's like a sort of a kind of a throw out there term that someone's got back issues, they've got chronic back pain, had it for a while, no one really knows why. So they'll just say, oh, you've got non-specific back pain. So you've got back pain, we don't know what the cause is, you're just going to have to live with it, and that's that. Unfortunately, that is not the case. Well, fortunately, that is not the case. At any time that you've got back pain or back issues, there is always a cause or causes. Now, those causes might not be immediately obvious, they might be a little bit insidious, they might need a little bit of investigation to find out what they are, but they'll definitely be there. You know, no one just has random back pain for no reason, like some sort of phantom or spirit that kind of attacks you at will with kind of no prediction and no idea why it's happening. There will be causes. And that's one of the most important jobs that we need to do when we deal with back pain long term. Is, I like to say there's two halves to the story. There's the most obvious half, which is exercises, stretches, mobility drills, whatever it may be that you need. But before you get to that, we have to get clarity as to understand why you keep getting these back flare-ups and you keep getting this back pain, because there will be aggravators, movements, postures, habits that you do, probably daily as well, you don't realize that sensitize that back to pain. So these are movements and habits that if they weren't there, you wouldn't have back pain, but also it helps explain that cycle of good versus bad days, so that when you're not really aware of what's going on, the back feels pretty good, you might have some bad habits and movements that creep in. That sensitizes that back, gives you a flare up. Once you're in that flared up state, you're going to become a bit more aware of what's going on, you're a bit more careful, and that starts to let it settle down again. And again, then once it's settled down again, the bad habits come back in and the whole process starts again. So there will be movements and habits that we call aggravators that are sensitizing that back to pain. There's always a reason. And a good way to think about it is a bit like having, imagine you have like a cut on your arm, and you have the cut, you get it all dressed up, and ideally you would just leave it alone and you let it heal. The back is the same. Imagine that cut is your back injury, and rather than just letting it heal, you keep picking at it every 5 minutes, and then you wonder why it's not actually healing. So if you can identify the actual specific reasons why you've got back pain, the bad movements and habits, remove those, straight away the back's going to start to settle and it's going to start to be less aggravated and get it off that knife edge. But you have to get out the notion that back pain is some random thing and there's no real reason for it. Some people get it, some people don't. There are always reasons. And if we accept that, that actually kind of empowers us to think, well, there's going to be a solution somewhere. It might take me a while to get it. It might not be immediately obvious, but there is definitely a solution to it, and I can work towards that solution because I know there are problems that I can work on. Principle number two, it depends. So what do we mean by that? We mean that the answer or the answers for one person are probably going to be slightly different to the next person and the next person and the next person. So although there are some quite common themes with the type of pain and injuries that people get, sort of disc bulges, herniations, sciatica, muscular pain, there are some sort of common themes there. How those people have created those injuries and the best way forward for them to get out of trouble is it's going to vary a little bit. So what we need to do is accept the fact that for each person, the answer, the solution is going to be a little bit different. And the more we can take note of those sort of subtle differences and nuances, the better result that we're going to get. So obviously I'm sure that, if you've had back pain for a while, every man and his dog comes at you with, different recommendations. I did Pilates, I did yoga, I did swimming, I did walking, I did weights, I didn't do weights, whatever it may be. And then you'll find, for every recommendation you'll find someone that will say, oh no, that made my back worse. And it gets kind of confusing because you don't really know, well, which way to go. There's so many options and you've heard arguments from both sides. You don't really know what you're doing. So what we need to do, along with sort of, the most important principle, part one, is if we find out the specific reasons for your back injury and a type of injury you've got, so the movements of habits that are creating that pain, already that's going to give us some major clues as to what the long-term solutions are going to be for you. because we already know the things that we need to avoid, which help let the back settle. But also, if there's certain movements and positions that are aggravating, we already know that there's going to be certain things that aren't going to work for you, even though you're trying to do them with the best intentions, because they're going to resensitize that back to pain, because they put you in movements or postures that include the ones that you are aggravators. So again, if we get specific understanding how you've created your injury, then we can use that as a starting point to start building a customized plan to work out what's going to be the best way forward. And like I say, for each person, it's going to be a little bit different. So other things we need to take into account, obviously type of injury you've got, how long you've had the injury, your aggravating movements and postures, the kind of things that you notice that tend to help the back feel a bit better, possibly what you do for a job, if you're active, not active, if you're an athlete, like you're trying to get back into a sport versus someone who just wants to be pain-free for day to day, how much stress you're under, how ill you can be, and also kind of the amount of work that you can tolerate in your current state to start building some kind of strength and kind of robustness in that back. So again, everyone's a little bit different. So you could have two people, you give them the same amount of work to do. For one person, that's the right amount of corrective work to do, and they start to excel and heal. For the other person, it might be too much. You can actually start to break them down and make them feel worse. So again, there's a lot of things we need to take into consideration, but the most important thing is that for each person, the right solution is going to be dependent on a few different things. And we can't just shotgun out a cookie cutter program at each person and just kind of hope for the best, because for some people that could be making their problem worse or just having no effect. So always find out specific reasons, and then the solution is always going to be, the answer is always going to be, it depends. Number 3. So we know there are specific reasons why you've got back pain. We understand that for each person, those reasons and the solutions are going to be a little bit different. So now let's try to understand how we actually create back injuries and how we're actually going to start to build an approach to managing those injuries and keeping the back pain free for the long term. So my favourite analogy, and I'm not sure where it came from, it may be Professor Stuart McGill, I'm not sure, is the idea of bank balance. So you need to think of that bank balance as the amount of work or aggravation your back will tolerate before you start to develop an actual injury. So that injury could just be like a flare-up in pain, or it could actually be like a disc bulge or a herniation or sciatica, whatever it may be, or how it presents itself for you. So with the idea of a bank balance, let's say that the average person needs, just for easy numbers, needs $100 in that bank account to get them through each day, have a little bit in reserve, and keep themselves pain-free. So that bank balance, how is it going to get drained throughout the day? So let's just say, for example, probably the most common aggravator for a lot of people in our kind of modern world is what we call flexion intolerance. So flexion is basically let that lower back slip into a rounded position, whether it's like a one-off movement or whether it's you kind of sit or your posture's like that for prolonged periods. So if we imagine that each time you slip into flexion, either when you awkwardly bend to pick up something, or maybe if you sit there for a long time, it starts to drain that bank account. So say you get up in the morning, all is well, we've got $100 in that bank account. Get up in the morning, a couple of awkward bends in the morning to put on shoes, get dressed, that sort of thing. That might take up maybe, say, $20 of that bank account. So already we've drained a little bit and the day's only just sort of started. So now, say we go to work, go in the car, or we commute in a horrible position because we haven't got a decent amount of lumbar support, so that back kind of rounds, and probably we're looking at our phone as well, maybe if we're on the commute, hopefully if you're not driving. And again, that takes sort of like another $10 out. And then we're going to sit down at work, sit down at a desk, maybe the chair isn't quite right for us, or we just tend to slouch in our posture. We sit down all day, and then for every minute we sit there, we drain that bank account lower and lower and lower and lower and lower and lower until we sort of get all the way to the end of the day. And maybe, if we're lucky, we've got sort of maybe only $10 left in that bank account, which would be fine if you went straight to bed or let it rest and let it recover and build up again overnight. But let's just say you've got $10 in your bank account and say on the way home you want to do some shopping, or you've got to help a neighbour move some furniture or something like that, and you have like an awkward bend, you have to go down, pick something up a bit heavy and a bit awkward, and that movement needs $15, but you've only got $10 in that bank account. So we're going to drain to zero, and then we're going to slip into overdraft, and then bang, that's when we have that flare up, that, oh, here we go. Next few days or weeks, we're in trouble now until that bank balance, we can rest the back and let the bank balance start to build up again and let it all start to settle. So if we get the idea of a bank balance, it does a couple of things. One, it helps explain, because more often not people have the idea that, my back was fine, but then I just bent over to pick up something small or silly and it just went bang and it grabbed, and I didn't understand why. It's because that bank balance was low and you didn't have enough in the bank balance to do whatever that kind of seemingly small movement was at the time. It just tipped you into overdraft, and that's what set that spasm off and that bit of damage. But also long term, we start to understand that if we're going to be pain free, there's two things we need to do. One is we need to, with that bank balance, we need to minimize the withdrawals that we make. So if we understand what our aggravators are, because those aggravators are the things that make those withdrawals. So again, it could be awkward bends, sitting with bad posture for a long time. If we start to minimize those things, then we're not going to drain that bank account as quickly as we did before, or nearly as far as we did before. So already we're going to help keep ourselves out of trouble and keep ourselves out of a flare-up by just learning to manage that bank account and not just kind of spending it on stupid things that we can control. But also we understand that maybe at the moment, if you're just trying to get pain-free day to day, you might not even have $100 in your bank account. You might only have 50 or 20. So we know we need to minimize the withdrawals from the aggravators, but then we also need to build that bank balance up so that we've got enough to get you through each day, plus a little bit spare as a safety buffer for times when maybe you're stressed, or you couldn't avoid some aggravators, or tired, didn't sleep well, whatever it may be. We've got a little bit of safety buffer left each day. But then also what we need to think about is if the average person, just to get through day-to-day life, might need, say, $100 to stay safe and get himself out of trouble. If you're somebody who wants to maybe go into a gym and start to train, you might need more. So we might need to build you up to maybe more like 200. So now you've got enough to get you through day to day, like the other person, but you've also got some in there to cover fatigue from training and the volume you do from training. But then on top of that, say this is kind of controlled, normal kind of exercise and the average person would do. Perhaps you want to get into a competitive sport. You're trying to get back to, say, maybe rugby or jiu-jitsu or whatever it may be that you want to get back into. You might need even more again. So you might need more like 300. So our goal, like the other two, is we build you the 100 to get you through day to day. That gets you safer there. They need a bit more because you're being active, but then also because you've got a competitive sport, which is a bit more unpredictable, a bit more intense, you need more again. So it's more to spend, but also more safety buffer to keep you out of trouble. So we know, using the bank balance analogy, we know we have two things to do. We have a list of movements and aggravators that make withdrawals on that bank account. So we need to minimally sort of manage those better, ideally remove them completely and exchange them for movements and habits that don't make withdrawals on that back. That's what we call sparing the back. And then the second part of our job is how we approach our rehab and our strength training to help build that bank balance as big as possible so we can do all the things we want to do. We've also got some safety buffer there to keep us out of trouble for when things become unavoidable. Maybe you've gone on long travel, stressed, tired, whatever it may be, and that bank balance has been a little bit drained. We know we've got a bit of safety buffer to spare to keep us out of trouble. So the idea of the bank balance is very important for helping explain how we get back injuries and how we deal with issues long term and keep ourselves out of pain long term as well. But if you can get your idea around that, so minimizing withdrawals, building that bank balance as big as possible, then things start to become clear as to how we're going to structure a tailored program for you that's going to help build a pain-free and more robust lower back. Before is that disc bulges and herniations will heal provided we remove and manage the movements and postures and aggravators that have created that damage. So to help kind of shed light on this, let's talk about one of the most common mechanics and injuries that we can create, which is what we call a posterior disc bulge, which eventually can become a posterior disc herniation. So if you imagine here my crude drawing here, there are two vertebrae, so these are the bones that are in your spine. Obviously between the bones, between the vertebrae, we have these little discs in here, which act kind of like, they give us the ability to actually bend our spine, they kind of hold the spine, help hold the spine together, but also kind of act like shock absorbers and buffers for damage. So when we talk about sort of, disc damage, it's actually pretty hard to create disc damage in like one go. It's more like you would have created a lot of the damage very slowly over a long period of time with slightly goofy movement mechanics or bad habits and postures, and then eventually it would have been something that kind of tipped it over the edge. So how do we create this sort of injury? So if we got, imagine here we've got a nice healthy disc here. So we have the kind of the outside area, which is very tough, fibrous connective tissue called the annulus fibrous. Inside, we actually have a gel-filled nucleus inside, which again helps mitigate force going through it, a bit like a shock absorber would. So what happens over time is that how we create a bulge or a herniation is that the fluid inside the nucleus is going to work its way through the layers out to the edge to create a bulge, and eventually it'll kind of burst through and create a herniation. So how is that damage created? Well, if we took that disc out, for example, and we're going to look at it from a kind of a top-down view, it almost has a kind of similar structure to sort of layers of an onion. So if we were to take it out, this is our disc here. The annulus fibrous, the tough material outside, actually has layers in it. Again, similar to what you get in an onion, like this. What makes that disc tough and durable, but also gives it movement. So in the middle of here, we've got our gel-filled nucleus here. So what happens is that, say we're flexion intolerant, what we call flexion is basically rounding that lower back. So say we're going to take that disc out, we're going to use this balloon as a bit of a crude model here. When we flex, what actually happens, if this is the rear of our spine, this is the front. So we're rounding out, we're opening up the rear to sort of round forward, and we're actually compressing the front of the disc. So if we look at the balloon, imagine this is one vertebrae, this is another vertebrae, and the balloon is the disc. Imagine if we flex, we sort of compress the front end, and if you can see it pushes, it creates force to push out towards the back. So if it's within limits, it's not going to do any damage, but if that happens too much, too often, that's actually going to start to push the nucleus out, and it's actually going to start to snake its way through the layers. So imagine if this is the front here, this is the rear of a disc, so we're compressing here, we're compressing force here with our flexion, and we're forcing out the nucleus this way. So what that looks like from top down is we're going to create compressive force on the front, and we're going to start to force fluid. It's going to snake its way through the layers, and then it's going to come out, and eventually it's going to create what we call a bulge here. So that bulge is when it hits the last area, the last layer of the fibrous material, but it hasn't quite reached through. So at this point, you could have a bulge, if you're unlucky, that's just sort of starting to touch the nerves in your back, which is going to give you things like sciatic pain or numbness or other things that might go on. If those compressive forces are still going on unchecked, so those aggravators are still running wild, what's going to happen eventually is that bulge is going to burst, and it's going to become a herniation. So when we have a herniation, we actually start to leak fluid out, and we start to lose a bit of disc height. So if you've got an MRI scan, you might see that the disc that's got a herniation that's damaged actually looks slightly darker in colour than the other discs that are healthy. That's because you started to lose fluid, so therefore it's going to look dark on the MRI scan. So obviously over time, what we need to do is we need to identify for you what are the specific movements and aggravators that are creating that damage. We need to manage and remove them to stop any more damage being created. But also, if we do remove them and we give the back enough time to settle, it'll actually start to gristle and harden any bulges or herniations we've got, and then start to nibble away at them and start to heal them. What it can't do is, if we've lost disc height, we can't reinflate the disc, but we can definitely heal the bulge and the herniation and stop any more damage from occurring, and basically let that disc basically go on early retirement. Because the reason why it's worn out is that the current movements and patterns that we've got creates too much wear and tear on that one or two discs, and they do too much work, so they wear out too quickly. They start to leak fluid, and that's when they start to break down. So we know that a long-term strategy is going to be identifying any movements that are creating this problem, this damage, removing them, let the back settle, and now let's replace those movements with movement strategies and postures that spare these discs from doing too much work ever again, so that we can preserve what we've got and keep a nice, healthy, unaggravated spine. But once we understand this, we know the importance, we really understand the importance of identifying for you what your specific triggers and aggravators are that we need to remove to stop any further damage from occurring. Fifth and last principle, again, if we want to deal with back pain successfully, that we need to understand, is that back pain is not forever. So what I mean by that is that, a lot of times people come in with a notion, especially when they don't understand the first four principles and are aware of them, is that they basically think that once you've got a bad back, that's it. You've got it for life. Sometimes you'll have good days, sometimes you'll have bad days, but it's basically now going to dictate, day-to-day tasks, what you want to do, and it's going to be there, and there's not much you can do about it. That is not the case. As long as we follow the first four principles and we get a clear idea of what's going on, and we can start to formulate a clear plan that's tailored to your injury and your aggravators, then we realize that back pain is not forever. However, exercise is. So that was a great phrase coined by the wise and powerful Dr. Andrew Locke, is that, we don't always have to be in back pain, but we do have to realize that we're going to have to do maintenance work and exercises to keep that back strong. A bit like, brushing and flossing your teeth. If you do the right maintenance work, keep things in check, then the pain-free back will be yours. If we get lazy and let bad habits creep in and we don't do enough of the maintenance work that we need to do, it will start to come back. So think about that bank balance. Just like any other bank balance, it's going to be dynamic in nature. If we make too many withdrawals and it gets low, then everything's going to start to flare up. It's going to start to get aggravated. If we're good, we minimize the withdrawals and we pay in that bank account and keep it as high as we possibly can and keep it well maintained, then a pain-free, robust back is going to be ours. And then we just have to keep that bank balance high enough for all the things that we want to be able to do. But it does mean that we have to keep on top of that maintenance work, not take it for granted, keep it healthy, keep it strong, and not let it slip back into kind of, low balance and where it's going to flare up and become angry again. So back pain is not forever, provided you look after your bank account, so you manage your aggravators and the things that withdraw from that bank account, and you keep doing the work to keep the back strong and well maintained, and that will keep you out of trouble.